Anyway, it's really nice to be here. Thank you for coming out on such a dreary day, but better than the last time I was supposed to be here when we were all iced in. And I know that this is a really busy time of year for you, so I really appreciate you coming out and listening to what I have to say sort of about food systems and my perspective on food systems. So today I'm really going to make a case for why planners should care about food systems, not just in urban environments, but from soil to soil, from cultivating our food supply to composting food waste. I'm going to give some background on where we are and how we got here, what I mean by food systems planning, which maybe isn't what everybody means, and offer some basic principles and practices to follow if you decide to do a food systems plan or as a standalone effort, or if you want to integrate food systems and agriculture into some kind of other planning process. At the end, because I'm not used to lectures, I'm more used to sort of dialogue and engagement. I hope you'll ask questions, offer comments, otherwise engaged. So to get started, I am from American Farmland Trust. AFT is a national nonprofit conservation organization. We were founded in 1980. Our mission is to save the land that sustains us, and we do it by promoting sound farming practices, protecting farmland for farming, and keeping farmers on the land. I've been with AFT for a long time, for more than 30 years, in lots and lots of capacities. But today what I have to share is really based on practical experience and working in the field, studying sort of planning in the perspective of planning, how it relates to food, but also to farming. Working in, probably 50 or 60 different communities over the last 30-something years, both rural and urban. And a lot of what I've learned has come from 2 USDA-funded food systems projects. They were multi-year collaborative research and extension projects where I seem to have gained the title of being a pracademic versus an academic. One called Growing Food Connections, and the other one called Pathways to Prosperity, which we're wrapping up right now. So basically, COVID was a wake-up call. It was a canary in the mind. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the 21st century food systems, but it didn't create them. When the pandemic hit, I'm sure everybody remembers, consumers were shocked to find empty shelves at grocery stores. There were no eggs for Easter. People were really appalled when temporary closures of a couple of meat packing plants ended up with shortages of meat in the supermarket, but at the same time, livestock producers, because they didn't have any other processing alternatives, had to euthanize their animals. Later, a congressional investigation found that in the first year of the pandemic, at least 59,000 workers in these meatpacking plants contracted COVID, and 269 of them died, disproportionately affecting low-wage workers from racial and ethnic minorities. But while they were failing to protect their workers and failing to protect the food supply, these companies earned record profits. Food prices went up, food insecurity went up, especially with children. So it was really a mess, but it also was symptomatic of what's going on in our food system. And I know Elizabeth said you guys aren't policy people, but I have to put it in the context of policy. So we didn't get here by accident. Food and farming systems are deeply influenced by policy, especially federal policy, and especially this omnibus piece of legislation called the Farm Bill, which is up for reauthorization this year. So it actually is something, if anybody's interested in these issues, is something to pay attention to. To frame it in a food systems context, even though it's called the Farm Bill, right now about 80% of its funding goes to nutrition, mostly to SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Program, food stamps. For decades, federal policies have been driven by this get big or get out paradigm. And it was famously expressed by Nixon's Ag Secretary, Earl Butz. These policies encourage specialization and consolidation in the food and ag sectors, and this has led to increasing concentration throughout the food supply chain. On the processing side, 4 multinational companies control 85% of the purchasing and processing of beef. In pork, its 4 companies control 70%, and on the retail end, it's 4 companies that control about 50%, and that's Walmart, Amazon, Costco, and Kroger. So the concentration and consolidation really makes a difference. And it's been driven by policy. But, you know, these cheap food policies, which a lot of people call them cheap food policies, did achieve their goal, right? They got increased production and distribution efficiencies. And we now have a very diverse, plentiful, and for most people, affordable food supply. They just did so without accounting for the true costs of food. Thanks to specialization, total farm output has increased significantly. And on average, most consumers spend only about 10% of their disposable income on food. But cheap food hasn't ensured good health for people, for the environment, or for communities. 30 million, well, actually now it's up to like 34 million people live in food insecure households. And for SNAP participants, most of them say they can't afford healthy food. And this is driven, you know, by things larger, obviously, than policy. It's driven by economic disparities and barriers to food access. But it's most prevalent in big cities and rural areas, and its impacts most severely felt by Black, Hispanic, and single-family households. A cheap food isn't necessarily nutritious. There was a really good Harvard School of Public Health meta-analysis, and it found that on average, a healthy diet costs about $1.50 per day more than unhealthier, likely due to policy, again, focused on producing high-volume commodities and highly processed junk food. And we all know that eating too much junk food leads to a whole lot of chronic health diseases. But there are also environmental costs, right? And cheap food policies don't account for those either. So the drive towards specialization separated crop and animal production, which really do better together in a diversified system. This increased the need for synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, antibiotics to boost livestock growth, large lagoons for livestock manure. If you've ever seen one, they're really not very attractive. These inputs add costs to farm operations. They degrade the environment. They harm human health. And the environmental costs have been, you know, widely reported on, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but they include, you know, lack of soil health, soil compaction, erosion, air and water pollution, loss of habitat, biodiversity, wildlife, and all of the rest. But it also had a really bad effect on rural communities, right? So in 1900, there were 6 million farms, and they supported a population of 76 million people, mostly living in rural areas. Over the course of the 20th century, the number of farms dropped significantly, more than 60%, but average farm size went up 67%. And that trend continues. Since 2000, farm size has continued to increase, while farm numbers have continued to fall. So now there are only 2 million farms supporting a population of 330 million people. And again, thanks a lot to policy, a lot of the farms which used to feed their families and feed their communities now are selling wholesale commodities to global markets. So as the farms get bigger, right, and the farm numbers drop, what you see happening is more and more of the wealth concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. So the very smallest farms, which are the ones in blue, which are obviously most of the farms, when you look at how much blue is in this chart, right? The smallest farms sell less than $2,500 a year, and they represent 40% of the total. But 2/3 of all farm production comes from less than 5% of producers. And they have at least $1 million of output, and they're reflected in the orange and the yellow. So the yellow is large family-owned farms, because 98% of farms are actually family-owned. The orange are the corporate-owned farms, but when you look at them together, they're all the big farms. And the top 1% of the very largest, most industrialized farms supply 35% of the value of farm production. And this shift came at the expense of the vast majority of farms and the kind of farms that we rely on for local food and to feed our communities. And it makes it harder and harder for a new generation to enter and succeed in agriculture. So it also came at the cost of rural communities, right? Small and mid-sized farms are most likely to be diversified. They buy their livestock, their equipment, their supplies locally. Their families interact in the local community. They employ more people. They create more cohesive communities, and they contribute more to local economies than very large farms. They're also more likely to sell into local food markets, helping to ensure community food security and a hedge against supply chain disruptions like what we saw during COVID. And for anybody who was living here, I don't know how many of you were living here during COVID, it was really remarkable to me how much food supply we still had in the valley when I compared it to a lot of my friends living elsewhere across the country where they really were affected much more by these sort of gaps in food supply at the supermarket. But these small and mid-sized farms struggle to survive given market consolidation, high land values, and a shortage of labor. Yeah. And most of them have off-farm income to stay on the land. So where 20th century food systems were transformed for productivity, now we have to transform them again for resiliency and for sustainability. And this is where I think planners and food systems planning have a really critical role to play. So what do I mean by food systems, and why do I always talk about it in the plural? Because most people talk about the food system as if it was sort of a single, monolithic, enormous thing. But I think that's a myth. I think that, in fact, we benefit from a myriad of overlapping food systems, nested together like these matryoshka dolls, operating at many levels from emergency food systems to global supply chains with community, local, regional, state, domestic, like people have so many names for all these things in the middle, nested in between. But each one is important, each one has a role to play, and we need all of them working together in order to ensure resiliency. And they all have something in common. They're all multidimensional, they're all social ecological systems, and they rely on natural resources like arable land, clean water, sunshine, light, various microclimates to produce diverse crops and livestock. They're all sustained by the management and labor of farmers, ranchers, farm workers, and a vast assortment of intermediaries who handle food between field and fork. And often these are the lowest paid people in the economy. They're influenced by things like dietary preferences and human behavior, by public policy, and market forces like supply and demand. Impacts affecting one part of the system affect the rest along with the price of food, so it actually matters to think about it as a system and not sector by sector. Why should we plan for sustainable and resilient, right? I think that it's going to come down to state and local folks. I think given the history and the powerful interests that federal policy serves, it's going to be hard and very slow to change it. It doesn't mean that we're not working to change it around the edges. But as we've seen with climate policy, state and local governments need to step up, and they need to lead, and they need to provide vision and lead in the right direction. And that's where planning comes in. And as you all know, planners plan for many things, right? They plan for housing and transportation and sustainability and hazard mitigation and everything else. But food system planning is pretty new. It really happened sort of at the beginning of this century when two planning professors, actually old friends of mine, wrote a seminal article urging planners to pay more attention to food. Since then, interest has grown so much that the APA, the American Planning Association, formed a food systems division, and Michigan State found that nearly 60% of states have created some kind of food plan or have one under development. So that's all in, roughly 20 years. But most of these efforts have focused on urban ag and urban food access. Focusing on the urban environment, which is important, but if it neglects the rural, it won't get us where we need to be. Most of our food is still coming from rural or peri-urban areas. And given mounting evidence that the Earth has reached a tipping point with climate change, it's time we take a more holistic approach to planning, address food security in the context of smart growth, sustainable ag, and community resilience. And to me, that's what food systems planning is and what it needs to be. And ideally, it'll include both planning for sustainable, and I sort of have a definition of what I mean by sustainable up on the slide, embodying the whole life cycle of food, and resilient, right? Because food systems play a role in and are affected by climate change. But they also have to be able to respond to shocks. And so I think we need both. So preparing for climate change is really important. For decades, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has documented the impacts on ag and food security from rising temperatures, extreme weather, other impacts of climate change. And it's projected that without intervention, these patterns will intensify with devastating impacts on vulnerable communities across the world and food security. At the same time, it's pointed to agricultural practices which can be scaled up to increase resiliency, including crop diversification, integrated production systems, practices that can ensure food security while improving the environment and mitigating climate change. And AFT actually does a lot of work in that space. Soil health is really important. It's important for food production, and it's important to combat climate change. And it's something that most planners don't think about at all. Farming practices that build soil health are among the most cost-effective and immediate climatic solutions. They support land's ability to serve as a natural carbon sink by drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide and storing it in plants and soils, carbon sequestration. And because of this, EPA actually considers ag a net sink rather than source of CO2. And a lot of farmers are beginning to adopt practices like no-till, strip-till, reduced-till, planting cover crops, diversified systems, rotational grazing, all of this to improve carbon sequestration. But they need to do a lot more, and they need to do it faster. So we have to deal with the fact that and sort of at the same time, we have to deal with the fact that modern farming practices contribute about 11% of total greenhouse gas emissions, largely due to liquid manure from concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. Folks are aware of local conservation district staff. They can help planners deal with these things, bring incentives and controls into zoning ordinances, other local land use regulations to improve agriculture's environmental performance. But while lots of communities regulate CAFOs and manure lagoons, very few incentivize soil health or things like methane digesters, which are a cost-efficient and revenue-generating solution to the waste problem and also create renewable energy. But however ag is managed, right, it produces far fewer greenhouse gas emissions than land converted to housing or commercial uses. And a study in California found that farmland converted to other uses emits greenhouse gas at levels someplace between 50 and 70 times greater than if it had been left in agriculture. This led the state to create a program called SALT, the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, to fight climate change by protecting farmland and encouraging compact and transit-oriented communities. But our farmland is threatened by poorly planned development, so we need to protect it as well as conserve it to support food security and to mitigate and respond to climate change. And that is clearly and always has been squarely in the planner's wheelhouse. So a study that I was involved in found that from 2001 to 2016, the U.S. converted 11 million acres of ag land. And for reference, if that number doesn't really mean anything, that's all of the land planted to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. This map shows where that conversion occurred relative to each state's best agricultural land. The dark green represents the state's highest quality farmland for food and crop production. It's kind of a metric we came up with. Dark orange represents the best rangeland. Red represents where conversions already happened. All that conversion happened at a time where we had the Great Recession, where there was low population growth, and by far the lowest rates of overall development in generations. Most striking, we found that large lot, low-density residential development in rural and peri-urban areas is driving that conversion, reflecting 64% of the threat and pointing to a need for better planning in rural areas. So we took that and we did a projection forward based on scenarios. And we found that going forward, without better land use policies, our most productive, versatile, and resilient soils, so that's what we call nationally significant or our best farmland, is over 50% more likely to be converted to development than any other agricultural land, which means that we have to not only protect farmland, but also protect high-quality farmland. So we have to look at it kind of holistically. And that's why I think that we have to take a soil-to-soil approach to planning for future food security, climate resiliency, and ag viability. And just to kind of drive it home, if you think of where our food, the food we actually eat ourselves versus things that have to be processed for us to eat, most of the fresh food that we eat, so 90% of our fruits, 80-something% of our vegetables, more than half of our dairy and our eggs and poultry, come from urban influenced areas. So they may not be, they're not in cities proper, right? But they're influenced, they're in metro areas, and they're the most threatened by development. And its availability became a hedge against supply chain disruptions during COVID. So we really need to think about this land as part of all of our planning efforts if we care about food security and food quality. So to shift, so how do we go about doing that? And I spent a lot of time thinking about what's the best approach, and I've decided that it really starts not with best practices. People are always asking me, what are the best practices? And it really depends. You know, if you're in Montana, it's going to be really different than if you're in Massachusetts. So I think that we have to focus on principles and practices. And principles drive practices. So who do we include in the planning process and how? What questions do we ask? What data do we analyze? And what recommendations do we make? Since food systems are multifaceted and complex, the forces that affect them cut across multiple sectors. So it goes without saying that we really need a systems, not a sector by sector approach. And that kind of underlies all of the principles, right? But several organizations have shared what they think are the principles to guide food systems planning, and I kind of looked at all those and thought about my own experience. And I think there really is a shared set of principles. And it includes diversity, and that's diversity sort of across everything, right? So in size, scale, geography, practices, preferences, culture, demographics, all of it. We have to really think about that full panoply that exists within our food system. It has to do with health, individual health, community health, ecological health. It has to do with equity, equitable access to food, to land, and other essential food system resources. It has to do with transparency and fair treatment throughout the supply chain, and that's to people, that's to workers, that's to animals, that's to the earth. And it has to do with resilience in the face of challenges and disruption. So then what's the process? And we, in Growing Food Connections, we created this kind of diagram. And I don't think it's any different really from what anybody does in any other kind of planning. But I think what we came to was that instead of thinking of it as a linear process where you start with data or you start with community engagement or you start with something, it's really iterative and it's a more spiraling process. And so at some point you need to assess trends and conditions, right? At some point you need to envision a future and do your goals and do your objectives and share them and get feedback. But it might go back and forth, and as you get data, that might affect your goals and your vision and vice versa, right? And then you have to generate recommendations to move forward priorities and achieve goals. But it's not enough to just have recommendations. I've done a lot of plans that just sat on shelves, right? It's really important to implement those plans. And so build implementation and how you're going to implement and who's going to implement right into the process. And then measures. Are we hitting our goals? Do we need to adjust? Do we need to change? Do we need to go back and think again? And we put engagement in the middle, and it really should go on the outside too, because we really believe that community engagement is essential throughout the process. And I know it's expensive and I know it's hard to do, but I really think you get much better plans if it's stakeholder-led and stakeholder-driven instead of somebody coming in, and I'm often that person coming in from the outside and sort of saying, this is what should happen. It's much better if it comes from the community, because then whatever recommendations are suggested are much more likely to be implemented. So it's kind of a spiraling process. So the other thing is, how do you engage in that process? And I used to be very much of a problem solver. So you kind of come in and you say, let's do a needs assessment. What are the problems? What needs to change? What are the barriers to creating change? While it's important to eventually get to all of that, what I found is that leading with that is basically a deficits-based approach. And it can be really discouraging, especially in underserved communities, especially in rural communities. and it leaves people feeling as if they themselves are deficient or they themselves are a problem in their community, because every time you find a problem, then the problem has a problem within a problem, and it all becomes problems. So instead of turning to each other for support, they focus on problem solving, and then they say, well, we need somebody from the outside to come in and help us solve our problems, which if you're in an under-resourced community is really hard to do. So I have come to much prefer an asset-based approach. So that's, you know, the little engine that could, I think I can, chug-a-lug, chug-a-lug. Because all communities have assets, even if they don't have wealth, right? So identifying and celebrating their assets interrupts the negative conversation, and it gets folks excited about what they have to work with and what they can do working together. And so what we've turned to, especially in this Pathways project that I mentioned, is, you know, not only taking an asset-based approach, which I think is really important, especially in rural communities, but also using this community capitals framework. Is anybody familiar with this framework? I wasn't either until we started to use it. So it's sort of based on the idea that you want to mobilize the resources you have to create new opportunities and respond to needs. And that takes, you know, formal and informal research. It takes engagement with networks and local organizations who can help identify those resources and move things forward in a sort of stakeholder-centered and empowering way. But this framework actually says there's 7, and sometimes I've seen people use 8, but we'll stick to 7 different kinds of assets in a community. And some of them are pretty obvious, like financial capital is, you know, things like banks and CDCs and CDFIs and so on. Built capital is something planners work around a lot, right? Buildings and roads and bridges and supporting infrastructure and all of that. Social capital, I personally hate the term. I really prefer to just talk about assets. But social capital is the relationships between people. And in rural communities, that's really strong. It includes sort of bonding activities between people who know and are close to each other, bridging activities between people and groups who are not closely tied, but could be because they have common interests, and linkages to harness relationships from outside the community to support local goals and activities. So human is like workforce development and education and training and institutions like healthcare and childcare and schools. Cultural assets are shared beliefs and attitudes and values, but they also can be things like fairs and festivals and libraries and museums. Natural capital is obviously really important to food systems, so it's the whole range of ecosystem amenities, from good quality farmland soils to water resources to microclimates to wildlife habitat and so on. And then political capital refers to people in positions of power, but also access to power and the ability to influence decision making. And if we bring all of this into our planning process and help people sort of identify where they have their assets, then some of those gaps become evident, but at least we're working from a place of what we have instead of what we have not. And I think it brings about change much more rapidly. So then, you know, the final sort of piece of all of this is that engagement that I said was in the middle, but it's also around the outside. And that collaboration is really key. So you have to figure out sort of who's there, who's at the table already. And that's often people who work in organizations that serve people, but also who isn't at the table, and then figure out how to find those people and bring them into the process. Because often they're the people who are most affected by the plan and by the policies, but usually left out of the process. And these leads to plans that address real rather than perceived needs. And, you know, I think it's probably sort of cliched at this point that people say that change happens at the speed of trust, but I think it's cliched because it's true. And since food system stakeholders come from many backgrounds and reflect many interests, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of patience to build that trust. But it's really essential. And while plans rely on outside consultants, it's really helpful, like me, as I come in a lot to do these things, it really helps to have people who are embedded in the community playing a leading role in the outreach and the strategies and the planning activities. And so then the other piece that's really important is using the right data and finding the right data. there's a lot of sort of government data that can be used. It can be really hard, especially like working in Massachusetts where everything happens at the municipal level and all the data is at the county level. But usually we don't have the resources to go deeper and to actually do all that surveying ourselves. If we can, it's really important. So, sort of within a budget, it's important to prioritize what you really need. But collecting reliable data is vital to figure out trends and conditions and opportunities and challenges. So some of the ones that we tend to rely on are, the Census Bureau American Community Survey. People are probably familiar with that. Also the NAICS classifications, the North American Industry Classification System. I had to write it down because I was calling NAICS, which is the standard that's used by federal and other statistical agencies to classify businesses. And then the Census of Agriculture, which is the most, thorough, extensive source of data over time. It goes back, to the 19th century. But again, depending on what level of government you're working at, you may need to do your own data collection to get at specific things that are happening, or walk around town to do your own mapping and that kind of thing. So finally, a plan, I think I mentioned it before, it has no value if it just sits on a shelf. It has to be down to earth, it has to be actionable, and people have to believe in it to make it happen. So I always think that you have to plan with implementation in mind, and that leads to the partnerships, and to the policies, and to the programs, and to the public investment, and into the personnel, and into it's a lot of P's, a lot of positive food systems change once the plan is approved and adopted. So it's helpful to learn from promising practices from other places, and Elizabeth mentioned this earlier, but we do have a lot of this on AFT's website, but also on the Growing Food Connections website, which is up on the slide. It's really good to just start to look at what other people have done and the challenges that they've faced. So we also have these two sort of worksheets, they're like fillable PDF. It's kind of primitive actually, but where you can kind of go through and assess kind of where you're at in terms of different elements of the food system. And that's a good thing to do sort of at the beginning, the middle, and the end of a plan to say, are we kind of hitting it all or are we not? And those are up on our websites too. So basically to conclude, sort of building off assets, but recognizing constraints, effective food systems plans integrate all these multiple sectors and interests from soil to soil. And it's not easy to balance them, but that's okay, right? So rely on things that have worked in other planning efforts, but also look to places that have done innovative things and take a really holistic approach so that you can actually start to bring about the change that we need to see.